Good morning, everybody. This morning's talk is going to be about radiator caps. And radiator caps, what's their function? What do they do? Well, the short of the story is radiator caps have a spring in them. They have two springs, actually. A lot of people don't realize a radiator cap has two seals. It not only seals down at the point where it goes down into the filler neck of the radiator in the bottom, but as it comes up and then umbrellas, there's a second seal at the top, so it has a double seal. And in that radiator cap, the bigger spring is the one that is attached to the main opening. That opening, as temperature inside the coolant increases, that pressure that's built up inside the system will push that valve open into that main spring, and it will bypass and fluid will go back to the reservoir, the overfill. But when it starts to cool down, there's a secondary spring. As it cools down and it goes to pull back in, as the radiator fluid starts to drop inside the system, it'll pull vacuum on the secondary spring that's in the center of the radiator. It will allow fluid back in, and that's how it regulates the transfer of fluid from the overflow back to the radiator so it can keep proper level. Now, if you've ever had a faulty radiator cap, and say you're driving your vehicle and then you shut the vehicle off, and then a few hours later you come back out to the vehicle and you look at the upper radiator hose, you'll see it's all collapsed and smushed. That's because that vacuum valve inside the radiator is not doing its job. So as the coolant is trying to return and the natural vacuum on the fluid expansion inside the radiator, when it cools down, it tries to lower because it doesn't need to stay in its expanded state anymore. It's pulling on the vacuum valve, but the vacuum valve is not opening all the way, and it's causing a suction inside the system, collapse in the hoses. So if you've ever walked up to a vehicle and you see the upper radiator hose collapsed, you typically have a bad radiator cap. The vacuum valve inside the radiator cap is not functioning properly. Now, there's some caveats to that. The Ford Explorers, like the 2011 to 2019 Ford Explorers, they're notorious for doing that. Even when you put a brand new cap on there, there's something weird and funky with the system to where that vehicle will collapse the upper radiator hose, but it's completely normal on that vehicle. You can change it, put a brand new one on it, order another one, put it on it. Doesn't matter. It will not fix the upper radiator hose. It will still collapse. It's something really weird with the way Ford built that system. There's no fix for it. That's just how it is. Now, years ago, when I worked at an independent shop, we had a Toyota come in. It had an upper radiator hose that was collapsed. It'd been to two other technicians, and it was causing an overheating issue. And as soon as it came in the shop, I'm looking at the upper radiator hose, and it was all collapsed. And I was like, just put a radiator cap on it. You know, guys in the shop want to gather around and stuff and give their opinion on it, and I'm telling them, just put a cap on it. Order a $10 cap from the parts store down the street here, and just put a cap on it. Sure enough, order a cap and put it on it. Never came back, didn't charge the customer any labor. Fixed the problem. Sometimes people overthink things. What ends up happening is every pound per square inch of pressure that's on that radiator system, it lowers the boiling point by about 3 degrees. So if you have a 15 psi rated cap and water boils at, say, 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 times 3, so 15 psi times 3 degrees Fahrenheit on average for 1 psi equals 45. So you've just taken that boiling point in that system because you have pressure on the head of it, and you've increased it by 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So you just moved the boiling point from 212 degrees, which is the natural boiling point, and then you added 45 degrees to it. So now you've added 45 degrees to 212. So 212 plus 45 ends up coming out to what, 257, right? 212 plus 45, so 45 and 10, 55, 57. Yeah, so 257 degrees Fahrenheit is now the boiling point by just adding some pressure to it. And what that does is it causes the fluid to stay more stable under heat. Stops it from boiling. When it starts boiling, it causes all kinds of issues inside the system. It won't dissipate heat properly, it won't flow properly, it won't transfer properly back into the reservoir and stuff. It'll cause vapor lock inside the system. If it's bad enough, it could lift the radiator cap and allow air in the system as well. And now you're talking about locking the system up, making it not flow correctly. So there's a number of things that go along with a bad radiator cap. A radiator cap is a maintenance item, and I typically recommend that people replace the radiator cap, even if it is good. And this may not sit right with you, but this is me. This is what I recommend. Every 3 years, just put a radiator cap on it. They're like $10. Not a big deal. Just swap the cap out. No issue there at all. Well, this is the basics of the radiator cap. This is just the fundamentals behind, what it does. It allows pressure to build up on the head of the coolant to keep the boiling point, or to raise the boiling point so it's not boiling in the system. So the things that we talked about are the radiator cap seals the cooling system. It allows a vacuum secondary to transfer fluid back into the radiator as it cools down. And it protects the system. It increases the boiling point. So its whole function is to keep that system sealed, but allow its fluid to move out and back in and keep the boiling point high, so you're not causing issues inside the radiator. Now, if you have a cap that is faulty and it's not wanting to release at a given PSI, then you may have too much pressure in the system, which may cause hoses to break. It may cause radiator tanks, the tanks on each side of the radiator, the plastic reservoirs, they could start leaking. You could have too much pressure in the system and end up pushing out water pump seals, push out around your intake manifold. There's a lot of reasons why. Now, you can test your radiator cap. They actually have like hand pump pressure testers that you can pull your radiator cap off, and you can screw it into a hand pump pressure tester, and you can pump that pressure tester up to like 16 psi, and at 16 psi you should hear it blow off inside that cap. So you can actually hand test the cap. I don't do that because I just replace it. I don't like old radiator caps sitting on vehicles. Like I said, I consider it a maintenance item, but you can actually physically test that cap to see if it's failing. You can also test the coolant system as well with that same style system that you use to test the cap. There's adapters that will go onto the radiator, so you can pump the cooling system up to whatever that cap is rated at. So if the cap is rated at 15 psi, you pump the cooling system up to 15 psi, and then you can monitor for leaks. But you obviously want to do this when it's maybe just cold. Try it cold, and then try it kind of, it's hard to say hot, because I do it as a professional in my shop, hot, by venting off the pressure. So what you do is you grab the radiator cap and you'll click it until it gets to the safety stop, and then you let all the heat come out of the system, right? You let it bleed off, and then I slowly take it off the rest of the way if it's hot, and then I'll put my pressure tester and stuff on it, and I'll pressure test the system while it's hot, because you can have a hot leak but not have a cold leak, or have a cold leak but not have a hot leak. But sometimes it can be dangerous, so that's why I don't recommend everybody do this type of testing. And then there's different style caps. You have the old school metal caps, and then you have plastic twist-on caps that they're threaded. So you gotta pick and choose your battles here when it comes to what you want to test. If you have like the old school system, it's much easier to test than the newer stuff, because there's all kinds of different adapters. Like Ford, previous to 2010, may have had one style adapter, and then after 2010 they went to a different thread pitch on the plastic reservoir, and it's got a different style adapter. I have to buy multiple sets of these adapters so I can test all the different types of cooling systems and caps when I do it, but it's a regular maintenance item to me. So I just wanted to cover some of this stuff. Remember, an upper radiator hose that's collapsed after the vehicle has cooled down typically is because you have a bad radiator cap. That's the number one identifier of a failed radiator cap, in my opinion. Number two, it could be because the spring is not opening the primary to allow fluid to go from the radiator into the reservoir, and you could be developing leaks somewhere, and it could be because of a bad radiator cap as well. And then eventually we'll talk about thermostats next, but this segment was just about radiator caps. Y'all be blessed.
If a coolant boils, it can be as serious for an engine as having it freeze. Boiling coolant in the water jacket becomes a vapor. No liquid is left in contact with the cylinder walls or head. Heat transfer by conduction stops. Heat builds up, and that can cause serious damage. One way to prevent this is with a radiator pressure cap that uses pressure to change the temperature at which water boils. As coolant temperature rises, the coolant expands, and pressure in the radiator rises up above atmospheric pressure, and that lifts the boiling point of the water. Engine temperature keeps rising, and the coolant expands further. Pressure builds against a spring-loaded valve in the radiator cap until, at a preset pressure, the valve opens. In a recovery system, the hot coolant flows out into an overflow container. As the engine cools, coolant contracts and pressure in the radiator drops. Atmospheric pressure in the overflow container then opens a second valve, a vacuum vent valve, and overflow coolant flows back into the radiator. And that stops atmospheric pressure collapsing the radiator hoses.